Hi, my name is Chef David Woolum. I'm Baking and Pastry Arts Instructor at the National Center for Hospitality Studies at Sullivan University. Today, I'll be demonstrating pate choux. Pate choux is a very basic preparation that we use in both culinary and baking applications. It has a lot of applications. I like to call it a mother preparation because it's a basic preparation that we use in the pastry world that everyone should know. It has 5 basic ingredients: water, fat, flour, salt, and eggs. There are optional ingredients that can go into pate choux. The fat, for instance, can be varied. You could use butter, or you could use margarine. You could also use shortening or potentially olive oil. The liquid can be varied as well. It can either be water or milk, as the case may be. Milk will cause a browning a little bit more rapidly. It's got a little more fat in it, so it's going to make a softer product overall. So generally, water is preferred. Today, I'll be making it with water and margarine, just for the sake of presentation. So I'll start off, one of my first things is to start melting my fat. I want to get that melting before I add my water too soon, because if my water begins to boil, I'm going to have, or my milk as the case may be, I'm going to have some evaporation of those liquids. And I want those liquids in there in the proper ratio for when I add my flour. So I'll let my fat start melting first, just to speed the process of the fat melting. Sometimes we'll do that in the water, but typically the water begins to boil before the fat melts very well, and that can be problematic. Now, I don't have to wait for my fat to melt all the way. Okay, my water's not going to boil immediately, so I can add my water too once my fat begins the process in earnest. So here just shortly, I'll add that. I can also add my salt at just about any point. I like to add that to my water because that incorporates it much more evenly than just simply throwing it in with the dry or throwing it in at any point. Once it's dissolved in the water, it'll more evenly incorporate throughout the mixture. Finally, I'm going to add my water. Well, not finally, but at this point, I'm going to add my water. Give my water a little swirl to get the last of the salt out with it. And now I wait for a boil. The more I stir, the longer it's going to take for this to boil. So at this point, I don't need to stir it much more. I do have a little fat trapped there on the spoon. I want to make sure I get that down inside. So I'm going to use a tool to help move that out. It's important that we keep all of our ingredients in balance. They are all scaled for accuracy and consistency in our product, and so we must make sure that we keep those all together, which again is why we don't want our water to boil too soon, get a lot of evaporation, especially in a wide top of this pan. The evaporation will happen much more rapidly with more surface area. So we'll just be just a second here before that comes together. The flour we're using is high gluten flour. We want to build a little more protein content in this product. The interesting thing about pate choux is that it's one of the few products that is 100% physically leavened. When we talk about physical leaveners, we're talking about air or moisture. There is no added leavening agent, no yeast, no baking powder, no baking soda. So this relies entirely on the moisture to blow up, and it does it very well. It opens up the choux. Whether as an eclair or a cream puff or any of the other products, the center will be nearly empty because of the leavening power of simple moisture, which is a very strong leavener. I'm starting to get a little boiling on. My fat's starting to it's finishing the melting process. And so as this comes to a good full rolling boil, and I'm doing this over a very high flame, by the way. I don't want to have to wait too long for this water to boil. So it's as high a flame as I can get on my induction burner. Once it comes to a rolling boil, I'll add my flour. That allows the fat and the liquid to mix together so that they will be a more homogeneous mixture before I add my flour. I don't want my flour to land on top of my fat. So I'm starting to get a little steam and that boil is taking on. I'm going to go ahead and add my flour, and I'm going to do that all at once. Now, this is where you want to be careful. Right now you've got a lot of boiling water and fat in there, and you've added flour, and you've created a very hot paste. If you have problems keeping up with it, it doesn't hurt to pull it off the flame to slow down the cooking a little bit. Work in very small circles. Don't stir big, because if you splash this on yourself, it's going to burn you. And if you go to wipe it off, it'll only smear. So you want to be very careful at that point. At this point, what we've made is called a panada, a cooked mixture of water, flour, fat. And we want to cook this panada out. Essentially what we're trying to do is get the starches of which flour is mostly comprised, to absorb all of this moisture. So we want it to hold it in a nice stable mixture. Typically what we look for on a gas flame, what we'll look for is a skin to form on the bottom of the pan. And you can see here I'm getting a bit of a skin on the bottom of the pan, so this is looking pretty good. I want to cook it out just a little bit more, just to make it nice and even and make sure all of those starches get gelatinized. That's when they absorb the moisture and hold it, which will later be so important for the leavening and also for the structure. What I'm also looking for is the dough begins to tear as I stir it. It looks a little bit gelatin-like because of those gelatinizing starches. So there it is, and that's pretty much all I need to do with my panada. I've cooked that out fully, and now I'm going to add some eggs to it. But if I do that at this point, those eggs are going to cook. The panada is far too hot. So I'm going to move it to a mixing bowl. You'll want to get that pan soaking with some water in it to get that skin out. And I'm going to put the paddle attachment on my mixer, and I'm going to use the paddle attachment to help release that heat. I'm going to stir it at a low speed. I don't want this to happen too fast, and I don't want it to get too cool either. I want my mixture to be under 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature that these eggs are going to cook at, and I don't want them to cook. So if I get it lower than that, as I add the eggs, they'll incorporate without cooking. Another unique thing about pate choux is that it can have some variation. It can use different amounts of eggs. So you don't want to commit your eggs by breaking them all into one container right away. And there's no reason to whisk them ahead of time either. Now, to be sure that I've got my panada at the right temperature, I want to employ my bimetallic stem thermometer. Okay? And I want to shut off my mixer, and I'm going to place my thermometer into the mixing bowl to test the temperature. That's the only way you can be certain. There comes a time when you may be able to feel the bowl and know that you're in pretty good shape, but you want to make sure at first, because if you start adding eggs and they start cooking, then you're making egg drop soup and not pate choux. We're still a little hot. I'm at 145 right now, so I'm going to let this mix just a little bit further. I can go ahead and break my first egg. Notice that I'm breaking that into a container. I never want to break eggs directly into the mixer. If I drop a little piece of shell, I may or may not see it, and that could become bad. So adding that or putting that into this container allows me to control what goes in the mixer and what doesn't. I know I'll need at least 4 eggs for this batch of pate choux. The thing I don't know is if I'll need the 5th egg. But I'll give you some visual indicators and also some physical indicators, some things to look for that will tell you how much you need and what we're looking for in the ultimate pate choux. Check my temperature one more time. It doesn't take very long. If I cool the panada too much, then it won't accept as much egg in the mixing process. And the egg is vital for structure and also for leavening. All right, I'm at about 138 degrees. That's a good temperature. So I'm going to go ahead and add my first egg. You want to do this slowly, 1 egg at a time. If you add all of your eggs, you could potentially break your pate choux. You'll have a bunch of little chunks of choux floating around and a bunch of egg matter, and that's not going to ever mix together. I'm going to go ahead and break my next egg. Once that gets evenly incorporated, I can add my next egg. Once you don't see any traces of that first egg, then the second egg can go in. We're changing the structure of the panada. We're liquefying it. We're causing it to become a little more runny, a little more pipeable, and we're incorporating a lot more moisture. Eggs are mostly moisture, so they're adding a lot of water. And again, this is a physically leavened product. It leavens by steam, so having a good amount of moisture is going to be important. And my third egg is in. I'll add my 4th egg, and then we'll talk about what I'm looking for in the finished product, what I want it to look like when I know I've got enough egg in the product. And again, I'm waiting until all of that egg, all traces of that last egg are missing. And once they're all incorporated, I can add my 4th egg. Okay, time to make some decisions about that 5th egg, whether or not I want to add it or not. Well, the first thing I look for is in the mixing bowl, are there spokes? Are there lines of dough being pulled from the sides? And I see that there are. There's a line that pulls around, and there's a whole row of them all the way around the bowl that look like the spokes on a wheel. So I look for that. I look for a shine. The panada, when it comes off the heat, will be a little bit matte in its color, so it's not going to be very shiny. As you add the proper amount of egg, it shines up. Third thing I look for, okay, and this is something that I have to take it off the mixer for, is the way it drops off the paddle. When I lift up the choux on the paddle, and it's hard to capture on the paddle because it's elusive, but when it drops, I want to see a V pattern. Okay, it was explained to me like a beard, and you can see I'm getting that. As it drops, it V's. So this choux has enough egg in it. It has as much as it needs. Any more, and it's going to be loose and runny, and that's not going to be good. Had this broken off in a flat line, that probably would have indicated that I need more. And in a small batch like this, it's possible that you need a half an egg. So you really have to make that judgment call based on your experience. Mine tells me rock and roll. Okay, so that's good to go right there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is take the choux off of the paddle. We're done with the mixer. It's still quite warm, which is good. It means that I kept my panada good and warm, so I got the maximum amount of egg that I could get in there. I'm going to clean off the choux because there's no sense throwing that away. And I can get rid of these. We're done with these for now. And I'm going to move to a pastry bag. Okay, pate choux is typically piped out. You can make shapes with it other ways, but a pastry bag is usually your best method for whatever you're going to make. And there are a lot of things you can make with it. I'm using a number 9 plain tip, a number 9 star tip, and then I'll just cut the tip out of the smaller bag to use for swan heads and necks. Now when you cut that tip, or cut the bag, make sure that it's below the edge of the tip. If the bag extends beyond the tip, that's going to change the way the product pipes. The bag will change the flow of the pate choux. It'll change the shape of the pate choux, and that's not what you want. You want that hard metal creating good smooth lines along the outside. Also be aware of where these pieces of plastic go. Don't just leave those on your table, because those could end up as a physical hazard in food products. Again, make sure that you cut the bag so that the end of the bag is below the flutes on the tip. If it's not, you can trim the bag just a little bit more. Always better to go a little too little than a little too much. You can't ever put more back on the bag. But if you're below those flutes, those cutouts in the piping tip, you know you're good. And then this one I'll load separately. I'm just going to use a small spoon. To load my pastry bag, I want to cuff it back slightly. I'm going to scoop up some of the pate choux, and I'm going to load it into the bag. And I want to try not to add any air in there, so I want to pack it down into the bag. Okay, and that's enough of that. We'll just do a couple of heads and necks for our swan bodies. And then we'll load our other bag. Notice that I try not to get the pate choux up around the top edge of the bag. That keeps it nice and clean on the outside. The bag's not going to slide around in my hands because it's full of pate choux. I'll load it into my plain tip bag first, and then I'll move some of it to my star tip bag. And again, using my bowl scraper, it's a great tool for this job because it doesn't stick really well to the pate choux. Pate choux doesn't stick to plastic so well, but it does stick to you very well. So using a bowl scraper, you can get it all out of there, get it down into the bag, and then we'll move it from this bag to the star tip bag when the time comes. And make sure and get that all out of the bowl. You want as much utilization of that choux as you can. Okay. And again, make sure and cuff the bag up so that you keep the top of the bag clean. You don't want that all over your hands. That'll make your life a lot more difficult when it comes time to pipe. Okay, the next thing I'm going to need is a sheet pan lined with parchment paper. And underneath that parchment paper, I'm going to have a stencil. This stencil that I'll be using has 2-inch lines separated by 1-inch lines. So you'll go 2 inches, 1 inch, 2 inch, 1 inch, and then go back the other way and do the same thing. 2 inches, 1 inch, 2 inch, 1 inch. This creates a grid pattern. I like to say that stencils make us look professional until we are professional. Even the pros use stencils, and it's what makes things come out in nice even rows and everything look exactly the same. For eclairs, I'll pipe between the corner of a small square to the corner of a big square. Then I'll move to the next small square and do the same thing, and so on. And so I'll make a perfect row of perfectly lengthed eclairs. For choux buns, there's 2 options. The big square will make a large puff, so I'll put my tip in the center and pipe until it fills just the square. For smaller ones, I would use a smaller tip than a number 9, and I would pipe into the smaller box. This template will also be used for our heads and necks later on. So I put my template on the bottom and I put a clean piece of parchment on top of there. Okay? So I don't use up my template for one tray of pâte choux, and so that the ink doesn't bleed through to my finished product. If I write on the paper and then pipe on it, that's going to bleed through onto my pâte choux. So I'm going to wrap up the top, pinch the top so that it doesn't come back on me. For the eclairs that we're going to make, I'm going to hold the bag straight up and down, okay, at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to start at the small square and move to the large square. I'll be about a 1/2 inch above the paper, and I'll let it spread to about 1 inch wide. Once you get to the other side, stop squeezing and go back the way you came, and you'll break the choux off evenly. You won't have a big hump on the end. If you continue to squeeze, you'll create a kiss or a dot on the top. So once again, I want to start piping. I want to keep my speed and my pressure even. Stop piping once I reach the other side and go back the way I came. Let me show you what you don't want to do. If you vary your speed, you'll create what's called a dog bone. So if you start squeezing and you start thinking about what you're going to do, and then you realize, oh yeah, now I'm piping, and you go, and then you stop and you squeeze some more, you'll create something that's narrow in the middle, thick on the ends. And that's not going to bake out. That'll be there. So any malformity of the pipe choux is going to come out in the finished product, and you don't want that. So really modulate your speed. All right, let's move on to the puffs. For those, I'm going to use the big squares. So for that, I'm going to use the same technique, 90 degrees, 1/2 inch away from the paper, and I say that's about as wide as my little finger, so I can use that as kind of a guide. Hold it right in the center and hold it at a constant height until you pipe and fill the square. Hold the tip against the choux bun and then make a C, and it'll snap off the excess choux. So again, a 1/2 inch above, pipe until you fill the square, one smooth motion, stop piping, relax your hand, keep the tip directly on the top of the bun, and swirl off. Pipe, stop, swirl. Pipe, stop, swirl. Pipe, stop, swirl. Okay? You'll get a nice, even set of buns there to make into cream puffs. They can be used for a number of things. And again, they have multiple applications that we'll talk about. Now we're going to switch to our star tip bag. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to cuff it, and I'll just push this bag down in here, and this is a lot easier way to transfer your pâte choux. And we'll squeeze that off into the star tip bag, and I'm going to make some bodies for some swans. People love swans. I'm not sure what it is, but the animal shapes tend to sell very, very well. For that, I'm going to use the square again. Okay, but this time I'm going to start back away, about halfway back in the square. Again, twisting off my bag so that it fits neatly in my hand. I'm going to start back about halfway into the square at a 45-degree angle. Remember, for eclairs it's 90, for cream puffs it's 90, for swan bodies it's 45 degrees. I'm going to squeeze until the shell reaches the other side of the square. I'm going to continue to squeeze as I pull, and then I'm going to release the pressure. And it's going to create a teardrop shape. That's what we want. This is the tail of the swan. This is the breast of the swan. So once again, I will squeeze till it reaches the far side. I'll pull, and then I'll release. Squeeze, pull, release. Squeeze, pull, release. Squeeze, pull, release. This is how we make shells when we're decorating cakes. You can make butter cookies this way. It's the same technique. And using the template, I get a nice even row of swan bodies. Okay? So those are the things we're going to focus on. We're also going to do some heads and necks. But I'm going to go ahead and get these in the oven. To do that, I want to take out the template. We don't bake the template because it'll cause the paper to become brown and shriveled, and ultimately it won't be useful anymore. And now we've got nice even rows, and nobody needs to know how you did that. Off we're going to go to our oven. When we bake our pate choux, we want to start at 425 degrees Fahrenheit until it doubles in volume, and then drop the temperature to 350 until it's really good and brown. And we'll talk about what we know that what we want them to look like when they come out of the oven when they come out. So I'm going to turn to my heads and my necks because my swans would look kind of funny without those. For that, I'm going to use my template again, and this time I'm just using a half sheet of paper, because I don't need to make a whole lot of those. I have my small bag that I put my small amount of pate choux in, and I need to cut the tip off of that so that I have a little hole. It needs to be a fairly fine line. We want the heads and necks to look delicate. We don't want them to look rough and thick-necked. Those are their uglier cousins. And for that piece, I'm going to let that piece hit the floor, just again to make sure that it doesn't end up in my food. So I'll check my line. It's a pretty fine line right there, maybe just a little bit thicker. And again, just let that drop so that that doesn't end up in my food. Now for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the squares, and I'm going to pipe the number 2 inside a square. So I'll lay my sheet of paper on top of my template, and I don't want that to move. So I'm going to pipe a number 2, pipe up, over, around, and down. Up, over, around, and down. And notice what I'm doing there. I'm dragging a line. So I've got the line dropping out of the pastry bag. I'm not piping like I'm writing with a pen on a paper. Okay, the tip is not directly on. When I terminate, or when I finish piping, I take the tip to the paper to help peel away the pate choux. So I touch and it breaks loose. Now we need heads. So we'll go back, we'll squeeze a little bit to let it broaden out, and then draw down. So we broaden the head, and then we taper it by drawing down. And it creates a point so that the swan's looking down. That's what you want. Typically, that's people's perception of swans, is that their heads are down, their necks are graceful, long and arching. Okay, so that's what we wanted. That's what we want to present them as, just like that. Now, notice I didn't do these on the tray with my puffs and my eclairs and my swan bodies, because they're going to bake much faster. So they need to be baked separately. So I'll put these on a small pan or drop them right on the deck of the oven just to brown lightly in the oven.